All right, so you want to talk about deficits and debt. There's a lot of confusion around this and a lot of curiosity and interest, but also some of it gets to be a little tiresome and dry number stuff. So let's just talk about why we have deficits and how much deficit and debt we have. I apologize for all the lapping you hear in the background. That is my dog drinking. Apparently she was thirsty. Let's get ourselves oriented. So deficits and debt usually follow a discussion of fiscal policy, and that is because they are linked. When governments do their budgets, they're either in deficit or surplus, and a lot of the time that has to do with what they're trying to do to the economy. So here is a look at some high-income countries, in other words, our peer nations, in 2014. US, we have spending of 36% of our GDP. Hopefully you see why it's a useful way to measure compared to the size of our GDP. So US spending compared to GDP is easier to compare to Japan when we're comparing it to its size of GDP, because we have different sizes of our economies. So US, we spent more than we received in tax revenue. So our spending was greater than our income. That is a deficit in that year. And you can see that Japan also ran a deficit. So did Canada. So did France. What was going on in the economies? We're still, in 2014, slowly crawling out of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, that financial crisis that was super steep and devastating for a lot of the world's economies. And governments were trying to spend to help stimulate the economies. So what are we saying? We're saying the government's budget balance is a measure of the tax revenues minus the spending and minus any social welfare or other transfer programs they're doing. For instance, granting money to McDonald's to market their stuff abroad, welfare or food stamp payments to low-income Americans, etc. So if this thing is positive, then it's a budget surplus because we will have gotten more taxes in revenue than we did in spending. But more often than not, for the US and for most rich economies that are fairly developed, we have deficit situations. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But recently, at least, when you've had some severe recessions, you can expect those deficits to come and get bigger because discretionary expansionary fiscal policies will reduce the budget balance by either cutting taxes or increasing spending and increasing transfers. And vice versa, when the economy is doing well, sometimes the government does contractionary fiscal policies, ramping back up taxes and cutting back spending and transfers, and that is what brings the budget back into surplus. And the inventor of fiscal policy, John Maynard Keynes, who we've met before, always advocated that we should be running deficits during recessions, but surpluses during expansions. The fact that most of the time we run deficits these days is down to our politicians, and they're trying to get our votes rather than any good economic theory. If you're curious, here are some of the main sources of tax revenue for the federal government in a typical year. You can see personal income taxes are the single biggest source. We've got social insurance taxes, payroll taxes, etc., and then other taxes make up the other big chunk. Then we've got corporate profit taxes. And here's where that money typically goes. We've got government spending money on purchases of items, goods and services, and government transfers. This is where money is given and nothing is received, at least not tangibly, in return. So we're talking about transfers for medical care and Social Security, for instance. So let's be clear and specific about terminology. A deficit is the yearly shortfall in the budget, and a debt is the accumulation of all past deficits. So it's like if you run up a credit card debt of $500 this month and another $300 next month, your total debt will be $800. So the monthly, or in this case yearly, shortfall is the deficit and the accumulation is the debt. So what causes changes in deficits and debt? There's a lot of reasons. Part of it is the budget philosophy of Congress and of the president, but in a lot of times it has to do with how the economy is doing. So you can see This is federal deficit and debt as a percent of GDP. The vertical grade lines, of course, are recessions, and so you would expect during a recession that the government, if it were trying to help stabilize and stimulate the economy, that it would run a deficit, right? And that is true. So you see the numbers get negative below zero here, more so during recessions than they do for expansions. So it'd be kind of helpful and interesting to know what would the budget balance look like if we were not in a recession. And in fact, a lot of people do care about that. We call it the cyclically adjusted budget balance, or it can also be called the standardized employment budget. How much of a deficit we would have if the economy were at full employment, or in other words, doing really well. And here's a look at the two numbers. For the most part, they track pretty well. You'll notice what's called, so here's an interesting time where they diverged, and this is called the Reagan run-up. When Reagan was president, he started running larger deficits than had been normal before. And so we saw, even though the economy was doing pretty well in the 80s, we saw a lot of growth. We started running large deficits. All right, let's take a quick break and do a gut check. Holding everything else constant, the government's deficit will what? A, tend to increase during a recession. B, tend to increase during an expansion. C, will increase if the government pursues expansionary fiscal policy. D, answers A and C are correct. E, answers B and C are both correct. Go ahead and think about it. Pause if you like, and I'll share the answer. Answer coming in 3, 2, 1. D is correct. And now, just to titillate you, let's talk about why people are often worried about deficits and debt. They have long-run consequences for sure, and cause some people, called deficit hawks usually, to get really, really uptight about it. And they point to 2008 Greece that experienced a debt crisis. More on that in another video, but basically, Greece, people became so worried that Greece wouldn't be able to pay back its debt that they started loaning money to Greece only at very high interest rates. And so what happens is there's worries of default. So a sovereign nation like Greece owes money. This is how every country funds their deficits, is they borrow money, just like a loan, right? So anyone that wants to buy their T-bills, their T-bonds, basically their debt instruments, can do so, and just depends on a ready supply of lenders. And those lenders get pretty worried when it looks like they might not get paid back. So they start charging a premium, a risk premium it's called. And this risk premium you can see here, that's how much safer they thought German debt was from Greek debt. In the end, Germany, who was very safe financially, bailed out Greece and backed up their bonds, and so this brought Greece's cost of borrowing down. You can see here just how related deficits and debt are, especially clear in the recessions. Unless you think the U.S. is alone in running a lot of debt, think again. Norway, of course, has all that oil money, so it's in persistent surplus, but a lot of other countries at over 100% debt. U.S. in the COVID crisis is now up over 100%. This was a few years ago. There you have it, a little primer on deficits and debt.